Necroxix. Hello and welcome to me and my bad ideas, and I wanted to document it while I did it. So, this is a little diagram of what I was thinking. I wanted to consider the option of testing out using ESXi's clustering feature for HA and DSR. What that would mean, and this is for a future project, that instead of having just one server in the rack that runs like the home stuff, instead they would be set up as a cluster, and it would be done by having two or more servers and a separate shared storage. And the benefits of this would be putting all our virtual machines into the shared storage, and then the two servers would act as a cluster. It would have load balancing as well as failover. So the rough idea is if all is going well and both servers are running, and then we start up like 5 virtual machines, it'll load balance them between the two. And if one machine happens to be getting overloaded, let's say on CPU, then it'll actually migrate that virtual machine to the other server that has more available computation available at that time. And if for some reason one of these machines went down for some reason, say a hardware failure, then it'll reload those virtual machines live onto the other server to take over. So my thoughts were, how could I test this? Because I can't physically test this on my servers. They're in production right now. I can't have them go down. I can't mess with them and start changing configurations. And my particular setup is very specific. And I realized one thing I can do is we can virtualize it. We can virtualize this whole little experiment. So that's what I'm going to do. My goal is to recreate this setup that we're kind of seeing here in a virtual form. And I'm going to do that using my desktop computer, which has 32 gigs of RAM and I believe 12 or 16 cores available. One of the things I was thinking of doing was using not the latest ES 6.7, but rather ES 6.5 update 2 instead, just in the off chance that I might be working with more of the same server types that I currently work with, which don't support 6.7, at least not on the CPUs I use. But the host is upgraded to 6.7 and it can manage regardless. So if it works on 6.5, it'll probably work just fine on 6.7 if I have that option available. So I'm going to try and install 2 virtual machines that are going to be hypervisors. And then I think I'm going to try, and this is going to be an experiment, is put like a FreeNAS virtual machine that will store a handful of test virtual machines and see what happens in the cluster. So the first thing I'm going to do is do File, and this is on my desktop. On this computer, not on my servers, we are going to create a virtual machine for ESXi 6.5. I have an ISO somewhere. I'm going to hit Next. This is going to be called Server 01. We'll have the server running on a folder off of my NAS, which is running off my actual servers. Now we have 12 cores with which we could work with. Some of them are obviously being in use. I'm just going to do 2 by 2 to give us 4 cores for the instance. And we're going to give it 8 gigs of RAM. I'm going to use a bridge network because I want to give it a specific IP address. And we're actually going to tie that in with my existing vCenter. So we don't have to make a new vCenter appliance or anything crazy like that. I'm going to create a new virtual disk. And these disks do not have to be big. Normally you would install this on like a flash drive. I use 16 gig flash drives, so we'll just keep the default. And we're going to actually allocate all disk space now. I don't want it expanding and slowing things down, so let's do that now so it doesn't slow us down later. So once it finishes creating this disk, we'll resume. Okay, so it finally finished creating that disk. The system is now booting up. So here we are in the setup. So what we're looking at right now is a virtualized example of what one server will be doing. And normally this installation would be on a flash drive in my case, as I'm a big fan of putting ESXi on a thumb drive as opposed to on one of the hard drives in the server. It allows me to pull it out and put in a new one, etc., etc. It saved my butt a couple times without having to mess with the remaining data. And yes, if you're wondering, that behind me, right there, that is a box of Little Caesars pizza. $5 for one pizza, 2,200 calories, not bad. Allows me to spend money on other things that I consider more important than nutritional sustenance. Okay, so we're booted up and fully installed. We're going to do F2 to customize. I'm going to put in my password. We're going to change it so I can give it an IP address that I want. I'm going to set it to do a static, and 7 and 8 will be what we're going to use. Do we want to apply changes? Yes. And I don't know if we need to, but I'm going to restart the management network. Hit F11 and enter. And now I'll hit escape. So we've created one server. This will represent this server right here in our little oh so complicated diagram. And now we will go ahead and try to add that host into our existing vCenter appliance. There's that IP address I gave it. I'm going to hit next. There's the certificate. Hit yes. I told it just to use an evaluation license. And we are going to not enable lockdown mode. Hit next, next. All that's good. And it looks like it is online. So it sees whatever data store is on that little bit. Using VMFS 5. I think my servers are using 6, whereas this one's using 5 for whatever reason. Okay, so I just got done adding the new installation. So we have .7 and .8. And I intentionally decided to keep .8 not updated, as that will allow me to see what happens if I try and update a host when it's under the cluster load, if that's going to have an effect. And we are going to try to install FreeNAS, which I am not familiar with. So that's going to be another learning process for me. We're going to use FreeNAS 11.2, update 3. I see the first option for installing or upgrading. This computer is less than the recommended 8 gigs of RAM. Operations without enough RAM is not recommended to continue anyways. Yes, this is a lab environment. Select one or more drives. We're going to save right there. That's all you have to work with right now until I add another drive. FreeNAS can be booted in either BIOS or UEFI mode. I don't really care in this case. We'll just go with the default BIOS. That might matter in a actual server, but in this case it will not. So now it's asking me to reboot it. So first off, I'm going to say in my CD settings here to disconnect the CD drive or DVD drive. Yes. And while we're at it, we're also, and I guess I forgot to name it something more appropriate. but whatever. I'm going to go ahead and add a hard disk before we reboot, and we will go with the default SCSI, create a new virtual disk, and we're going to make it 500 gigabytes. I was doing all I could for yesterday. It's now a new day, and I broke something. So I am reinstalling the first ESXi. The second one is up and running, and I have FreeNAS configured, at least to have an IP. And I'm going to try to follow this random guide from TechBlock on how to configure NFS on FreeNAS and see how that turns out. So it looks like I need to go to Services and find NFS and turn it on and have it start automatically. Next I need storage volume, or I think I have to create a pool. See if I can create a new pool. I added the 500 gig virtual hard drive. I didn't have it pre-allocate because it takes forever. Do I click like this? I think so. So now we've got 500. I'm not familiar with FreeNAS, so this is also a very big learning process. The contents will be erased. Create pool. So I can see we have a pool that's made for that 500 gigs with whatever settings. I think I need to configure permissions next. And I think it's going to be Unix. I don't think anything here is different, so whatever. But I do believe next we need to create the share. Unix NFS shares. I'm going to hit add. Not sure what the path is, but if I click on this, I can see the /mount thing. So I think this is the path I need. Yeah, I'm going to click on all directories, but I'm going to keep the read-only off because I imagine I should want to be able to write to it. So let's see if that was enough to do anything yet. I'll just check on the second server in the data store. I will do actions, storage, new data store, NFS. I don't know if it's going to be 3 or 4.1. I'm just going to pick the latest version because I don't know if there's a difference. Shared. So I know it's on this folder, or on this IP. So I think we need this exact directory here. I don't know what this Kerberos authentication is. I'm just going to say don't use for now, and we'll see what happens, whether that actually does anything or if it errors out. And it looks like an error occurred during the host configuration. I figured something was going to go wrong. I'm going to try NFS 3. I don't know if this matters, but it says allows the data store to be accessed by hosts versions earlier than 6. Oh. Okay, NFS 3 worked out. So we now have access to the shared data store. I just mounted it over the network. So I'm going to go ahead and finish reinstalling the first server so that I have 2 servers up. That means I'll have 2 servers that are not updated as well. And once that is all done, we'll try and add that in the cluster or make a cluster and start messing with virtual machines on them and see what happens. So I am going to, before I add that, let's see how to do a cluster. New cluster. So this is going to be called cluster buttfuck. So DRS is going to be the first thing to turn on. Default settings. Bam. So DRS is sort of like our load balancing, if I understand that correctly. HA is going to be high availability. vSAN can be kept off probably. Okay, so here we have cluster buttfuck, and I see there's some information. So I've selected DRS and HA. Now they want me to add a host to the cluster and then configure the cluster. I try to do everything identical, so the same data store name, same everything. Let's try, instead of hitting add, let's try dragging and dropping. Okay, what would you like to do with the resource pools and stuff? Put all of this host virtual machines in the cluster's root resource pool. Is going to hit OK and see what happens. Looks like it's configuring something. If I click on here, I still see the data stores. It's still doing stuff. Hopefully I don't have to do any networking setups unique to this, because that's not really what I wanted to test out. All required hosts are in maintenance mode. Okay. Configure network settings. vMotion and vSAN traffic review, customize clusters, configure. I'm just going to keep the default of all this. Let me see if I can just configure this later. So we got host failure monitoring, virtual machine monitoring. I think we're going to want that on. Host failure to tolerate is going to be 1, whatever. I'm going to mess with all that stuff later. So I see it's doing stuff. There's red, so something's wrong. We have insufficient high availability failover resources, which does make sense. I only have one thing in the cluster. And what is this got a problem for? This has no management redundancy. That's fine. So I guess we'll do the maintenance mode for the second server. And move that one in here as well. So it'd be a lot easier if people would stop messaging me on Discord. So I went back into the little quick start thing. I see host 2 not configured. Here, let's go ahead and enter maintenance mode for both of these. This would be a lot easier if people weren't bugging me on Discord. Revalidate. Alright, so time is synchronized across the hosts. All required hosts are in maintenance mode, etc. So let's try the configuration again. Host settings will be applied only to the not configured host in this cluster. Okay. So now I see we got configured host, network, cluster, and hyperconverged cluster configuration compliance. Cool, I guess. Exit maintenance mode. And the warning is what? Cluster currently has no management network redundancy, and the number of heartbeat data stores for this host is 1, which is less than required. 2. Our DRS is set to be fully automated. I'd like to edit this. So automation, we'll let it be fully automated. This places virtual machines on a host at VM power on, and virtual machines are automatically migrated from the host to another optimized resource utilization. So I'm going to keep this DRS stuff fully automated, and I'm going to make it aggressive. Predictive DRS is going to be turned off. That would be a feature I would probably want to use. So like if one server tends to get loaded more at 5 in the morning because of, people doing things, I think that's what it does, is it predicts ahead of time based on patterns. I could be wrong. I'm not going to mess with that either, so okay. As for the HA, let's take a look-see. So it's turned on, proactive is turned off. So I'm going to edit this. failure response, default restart priority is set to medium. I'm going to not mess with the defaults actually. And I think you could probably configure this per VM. Heartbeat data store is what it was. I think I'll just have it manually like that. And hit OK. See what happens. I don't know what the deal exactly is, whether the HA will even work or not, but it's only a warning. So as I understand it, the number of shared data stores needs to be at least 2 for redundancy to really get the correct benefits. That's okay, we don't have to worry about that right now. So let us go ahead and just put a virtual machine in one of these now. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a Windows server, and I'm going to clone it into the Necroxix data center. We're going to call it Windows Server 1. And I'm going to click on the cluster, I think. And we can see the shared storage. Is that the one it's going to be using? We're going to find out. Customize the virtual hardware. We're just going to give it a network adapter. It should be just using VM network. And hit next. So it's going to go into it's going to clone that Windows server into the shared data store. Unable to access a volume. Okay, that sucks. Okay, so what I know at the moment is trying to move a VM into that data store. Errored out. Trying to create a new one as well. Errored in the same way. I believe it means that there is read-only access or something along those lines with this data store. So I'm going to start chipping away at it and see what the deal is. Okay, so I figured it out. At least a solution for now. Inside my FreeNAS, I went to my pool and I went into permissions. And these two were off before. So it was a permissions issue. And since this is just for this experiment, I don't have to worry about figuring out how permissions work exactly and all that. So all I did was I turned on write for groups and other, and I was able to browse into the data store, and I can see it actually has folders and stuff, and I can create a new folder. So boom, I have a new folder that I created, so we now have ability to write to that drive. So I am going to delete that. We're going to see if I can copy over a virtual machine again like I did before and see what happens from there. Hey, I see something. Okay, so I had to go take a break for a while, and now I'm back to playing with this stuff. I have cloned a Windows server and a Linux server into the shared data store. And I was also wondering about how I would like to view this stuff in VMware Workstation, which I like to use. And I added the server .7 and .8 manually. And I also added the VCSA itself, which gives me a similar view. So I have my cluster right here, and I could see the VMs. What was interesting to me is when I expand these, the Windows server and Linux server are being listed under each of these separately. And I don't know if I happen to have specified them in that way or if it just distributed them on its own. So let's go ahead and take the Windows server and power it on. And it looks as if it's running on the .7 right here. And if I go ahead and power on this Linux server, yep, it's running on the other. So my first question is, what happens if one host was to suddenly die entirely. So let's say the server that's running Linux right now, that would be the .8, I believe. If we were to just pull the plug, like not even a graceful shutdown, but if we were to pull the plug, let's try that. This is the .8, and we're just going to hit power off. Yep, power off. So it just, boom, got pulled. Linux server is not currently responding from the looks of it. Okay, so I can see it did move it here, although it's not currently running. This is not responding. And here's the thing I gotta note too is speed is not going to be the test here because the FreeNAS is using a virtual drive that is running on my NAS, which is already something running on one of my servers. So there's a lot of nested layers that are going to affect performance potentially. So I'm not testing this for performance, just functionality. But it looks like it's automatically booting the Linux server up, even though this host is down. And it is booting it up into the first server that is running. So that's actually pretty promising. That is quite promising. We only have one host running of the two in the cluster, and it automatically migrated and booted up the Linux server into the still running server. So we had Windows running on the first server and Linux running on the second server, and we just pulled the plug and killed the second server. And it took the Linux and it booted it on the first server. So my next question is, if I bring it back online, is it going to migrate it back or what? And that might depend on how aggressive it is, I suppose. Because it might be not an instant process. It may actually have a different algorithm to determine when it should do that for the load balancing. So I'm going to let it run for a while and see whether it takes the two virtual machines and load balances them on its own, or if I need to step in and either reconfigure something or manually migrate. So I understand that I shouldn't have to do anything. It'll automatically be able to do it as a load balancing type of mechanism. Right now I see a red warning, insufficient vSphere HA failover. Oh, okay, that went away now. So my understanding too with the HA for high availability, you want 3 servers minimum, which would make sense. But in this case, we only have the 2. What I might also try is later adding a third ESXi server, but like a 6.7, and see how that interacts. So just for the sake of having them doing something, I went ahead and hopped in the Windows server and I just started pinging on the Linux server. I picked a different Cloudflare DNS to ping. And if one of these machines gets powered down and migrated or something along those lines, then we will be able to determine whether or not something changed. If this is still running and it got moved, then we'll know. I'd like to see how we might go about upgrading one of these servers. Since the .7 is the one that's running both of these virtual machines, I'm going to see what happens if we want to put this into maintenance mode so that we can run updates. HA admission control will be disabled, might prevent vSphere's vMotion to proceed and result in downtime of the machine on the hosts you remediate. Remediation status is ready. Let's just remediate. I didn't even shut the virtual machines down. I didn't try and migrate them or anything like that. I suspect I can manually do stuff like that if I was to right-click and use migrate maybe. I've never used vMotion. Most of my usage has always been in the form of cloning virtual machines around, mostly for backups or to rerun it on a different system, because I believe vMotion requires that shared storage, which is something I have not had the chance to do until I did this little experiment with the virtualization. So at the moment, it looks like these are still running on the same host while it's remediating. So I noticed on the summary screen there are some interesting things that are dropped down, so I didn't even notice that. But I can see vSphere DRS has a little level measurement showing balance, and I'm seeing it having reported a DRS fault once. Could not find max VMS constraint. Not compatible with the virtual machine. Migrating from .7 to .8. When did it give that error? Is that what's preventing remediation, perhaps? Because it's been at 53% for a while. It says, unknown error, check the events and log files for details. And they are both still running on .7, so the remediation failed. So what happens if I do a migrate? I don't know what these compatibility issues are. The vMotion interface is not configured or is misconfigured on the source. So it's possible I may have to configure something to use vMotion, but so I'm just going to try and do this. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm trying it out under my host, configuring, network, and then add networking, VM kernel network adapter, select, I'm using the existing switch, turning vMotion on. I'm just going to let it automatically do it. I don't know if that matters or not. But I can see it's got its own IP. Does that make a difference now with this migrate? Oh, it does. Okay, I'm going to click next. So we have selected destination networks for the virtual machine by migration. I could still only select VM network. I'm going to hit next. Schedule with high priority or normal. We'll just high priority sounds fine. So we're trying to see if we can migrate this to the .8. I've never used vMotion before, so it'll be interesting. And when that's done, we'll see what happens. Okay, so that completed really fast. So I turned my recording back on. So the Linux server is on the .8. The Windows machine is on the .7. And it is still running. That's pretty cool. So let's do that again. I want to retest that. I want to see what happens while that's happening in real time. So we'll record through the whole way. So we're going to take the Linux server and migrate it back into .7. Next and next. Next. Okay, so that's started. And what's going on? So we're just pinging. Actually, it looks like it stopped pinging for a moment there. I see that the latency was going up. So as you can see, our normal 1 or 2 digit pings hit 230, 541, 800, 1600 milliseconds. So my latency went up, but it didn't experience packet loss. And now it's pinging like normal again, completely uninterrupted. Wow, that's actually really cool. And as you can see, it's really fast, even though everything is virtualized, including the shared storage. Okay, so at least with vMotion configured correctly, let's see what happens if I try and remediate .7 again. So we're going to go back to updates. And right now we have both machines running on the machine I want to update. So we're going to see what happens this time around. So let us remediate, and we'll see what changes while that's going on. All right, I could see my ping starting to go up here. It's probably moving this machine. Yes, it is. So as it's remediating, I can see it's migrating the virtual machines. So the reason it failed the first time around had been because I didn't have vMotion set up correctly with the vkernel, the VM kernel in the network for both hosts. Boom. My Windows server got a moment of latency and then is just chugging right along. That's actually really cool. Okay, so something changed, and I'm not sure if this is an error from before or with the last task. I guess the next question will be if I take the .7 and maybe put it into maintenance mode. Maintenance mode does not perform any activities. Move the powered off and suspended virtual machines to the other hosts in the cluster. Yes. There are one or more powered virtual machines. The operation will proceed once all machines are powered off or migrated to another host. So it's been about 10 minutes and it's still entering maintenance mode at the same percentage. So I'm wondering if it requires me to manually migrate things off of that. I was hoping that it automatically would move them, and maybe I'm just not giving it enough time, but I'm impatient right now, and I really want to see this happen, so I'm going to migrate the Windows server into .8, because there's another question in my head, and that is if I move the second VM into the other secondary server, which you can see we got a little increase in ping there for just a moment actually, but it's still relocating. Question is, if I move that there, is the DRS going to automatically, okay. So I can see that as soon as I told it to migrate, it finally entered maintenance mode. So I had to do that manually. I don't know if that's a result of the HA DRS or what, but I did tell it to migrate, and we were already trying to enter maintenance mode. In the meantime, it looks as if it was just waiting for it instead. So that was a little bit more hands-on than I was hoping. I was hoping it was going to automate that, but maybe there's still something that needs to be reconfigured for that. But that's still okay. Easy enough. If I want to update a host, I can tell it to go into maintenance mode, migrate everything out somewhere in the cluster, and then we should be able to go ahead and remediate these. And so what I'm going to do is come back after it's done remediating and boots back up. Okay, so I'm back, and the remediation completed successfully, and it already relocated the Linux server virtual machine into the first host, and the Windows one is running on the second. Okay, so this is a really cool feature set, basically. It looks like there's a few things for me to iron out still. So the main benefit for me doing this is that I would have two hosts, and I can take one host down to do updates and whatever maintenance might be involved and produce zero downtime, essentially. Like when I was looking at those pings, it's like there was just a momentary blip, but operations continued going. That vMotion stuff is pretty darn amazing. There might be more things to consider if I wanted to have better failover rates and things of that nature. But primarily, I wanted to be able to have a system that allows me to produce zero downtime because I have to come in and make some changes. I had one thought on this with the NFS, is one idea that might work is to get a single NFS that'll have a decent number of drives so that I can create a nice maybe 2 arrays and virtualize the FreeNAS. So I would create maybe 2 RAID arrays, passing those to 2 different instances of FreeNAS on the same machine. So if I was to run an update on the first FreeNAS that it would have redundancy and have access to the storage pool still on the second. Now, bottom line is pretty clear. I need to get myself a server that'll act as a NFS that will use not that much space, but it needs to have a reasonable amount of space available for storing all my virtual machines. And as a result, I can use shared storage, and 2 servers minimum will allow me to be able to load balance between, and also be able to bring one down for any kind of maintenance tasks. And it's expandable, so if it turns out I have more need than is available between just these 2 servers, we got a lot more things being added in, I can always put in another server, add it to the cluster, and it will just all flow. So the expandability is really good here.